I'm John Marmillo. I'm our Chief Product Officer here at Line Vision, and I'll be our moderator for today. As we dive into the topic of load growth associated with AI, data centers, and this incredible rise in electricity demand that we're seeing. And I'm thrilled you're joining us for what's going to be an information-packed session with three fantastic speakers that I'd like to introduce. Today, we're joined by Brian Janos, who is the Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder of Cloverleaf Infrastructure, which aims to expand grid capacity to support the largest electric customer loads to spur economic growth and investment. Brian also serves as a senior advisor with Green Strategies, advising companies from early stage to Fortune 500 on energy and decarbonization strategies. Previously, he served as the Vice President of Energy at Microsoft, and Brian is also on Line Vision's advisory board. Caitlin Savage was unfortunately not able to join us today, but instead we have Brian George, who is the federal lead for energy market development at Google. He's responsible for Google's energy policy and strategies across the federal government, including FERC and the Department of Energy. In addition, he's responsible for Google's wholesale energy market strategy across the United States. Brian has held previous positions in the federal government, both at the Electric Power Supply Association and FERC. And then finally, Hillary Pearson is our Vice President of Regulatory and External Affairs here at Line Vision. She is also the chair of the board for the Working for Advanced Transmission Technologies Coalition, also known as the WATT Coalition. And Hillary has been working on energy policy for 2 decades with key roles in the utility sector, solar industry, and the U.S. Senate. So welcome and thank you to our speakers for joining us. So I briefly want to share just a little bit about Line Vision for those who are unfamiliar with us. At our core, we are a data company. We provide utilities with a sensor platform technology that collects information on transmission lines, and we turn that information into insights to help solve some of the biggest challenges utilities are facing. These are things like expanding transmission capacity through dynamic line ratings to address the rapidly increasing demand for electricity. We help operators with grid resilience through real-time alerting during extreme weather events to ensure that safety is maintained. And we help with asset management. Many transmission lines are at or near their end of life, and we're able to build digital twins of these assets to understand how they're actually performing in the field. So really what we're doing is using data to help utilities achieve grid flexibility, resilience, and security. And speaking of data, let's jump into it. We're going to start by hearing from Hillary on the current state of the industry. Then Brian George and Brian Janis will share their perspectives. And then Hillary is going to bring us home with some ideas on what can be done. And we'll also have time for Q&A, so please put your questions in the chat and we'll get to those at the end of the session. All right, Hillary, feel free to take it away.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to be here with everyone. I'm excited to give some context about the day and age that we find ourselves in. Where data center deployment, partly driven by the need to power new artificial intelligence applications, is a significant factor of near-term electricity demand growth in the US. And at a national level, data centers are critical to supporting America's continued economic growth by powering businesses and also enabling continued leadership and innovation, particularly for AI, artificial intelligence applications. As I'm sure a lot of folks have heard this stat by this point, but they say that there's about, when you do an AI query, that requires about 10 times the amount of electricity as a traditional internet search. But when we think about it, the growing use of generative AI to make things like movies and music, could require vastly more power. So just how much growth might be expected? Earlier this year, EPRI put out an estimate that data centers could consume up to 9% of US electricity generation by 2030. That's more than double the amount currently used. And earlier this fall, Wood Mackenzie, they released a report that predicted that parts of the US could see power demand increase by 15% by the end of this decade, driven by power consumption from new data centers, but also from factories as well as transportation electrification. And this report was really interesting to me because it talked about World War II as the last time the US had faced a similar period. So again, this is World War II, from about 1939 to 1944, when manufacturing output tripled and electricity demand rose by about 60%. So that's quite the historical context. But today, the AI-enabled features of our increasingly digital world, digital lives, everything from chatbots to digital assistants, they're powered by an energy system that's really been going strong for just about the last 100 years. But today, as we're seeing this rapid load growth, it's coming at a time that the grid is increasingly under stress, as utilities are faced with the challenge of decarbonizing the grid while also addressing aging infrastructure and how best to meet the demands of a peakier grid system. And just as context, I think this summer, a utility in Texas noted that it saw a 700% increase in its data center interconnection queue. That was from about 1 gigawatt to 8 gigawatts just over the summer. So we're in an era where grid capacity really is the new gold. Traditionally, large loads have been able to interconnect without scarcity in mind. Utilities, they react to service requests and to load letters, and the grid has had time to adjust to serving those loads, as traditionally buildings, they take time to reach full occupancy, and factories tend to ramp up over time. But these power-intensive data centers are different. They require the utility to be ready to meet this expected demand on day one. And really, our country's geopolitical standing, our economic competitiveness, it is inextricably linked to the energy industry's ability to both serve these loads while maintaining affordable, reliable service for all other consumers. So as large loads like data centers essentially kind of go shopping for where capacity exists and for where clean power can help to fuel their needs, utilities are finding that they are essentially in a competitive environment to do what they are inherently incentivized to do, which is to serve load, although the exact trajectory of that load growth, no one is quite certain of. But what we do know is that we have some pretty staggering estimates for peak demand growth. Grid Strategies, a consulting firm, estimates at least 38 gigawatts of peak demand growth through 2028. This is driven by the development as industrial and manufacturing facilities. So I think a key question is do we have the infrastructure there to help meet that demand? And on the transmission side, it's not looking very encouraging. For example, the US installed about 1,700 miles of new high voltage transmission miles per year on average in the first half of the 2010s. But that dropped to only 645 miles per year on average in the second half of the decade. And last year, just 55 miles of new high voltage transmission was built in the US. So while it makes sense that companies are out procuring for their own clean power to help power these data centers, without a faster transmission build out and faster interconnection processes, these projects are at risk of just taking too long to come online. We need to be able to speed up overall transmission development and deployment, including by the use of grid enhancing technologies like dynamic line ratings to get more capacity out of our existing grid. And as we look to build new transmission, one of the biggest challenges that we see on the grid today are constraints that prevent a least cost resource from coming onto the grid. Instead, you have a more expensive fuel source, often located closer to load, that's used that results in congestion, and congestion has costs. Last year, those costs came in at about $11.5 billion nationally, and those are costs that do trickle down to the retail customer bill. Here in the Midwest, for example, according to a Grid Strategies report, about 45% of all real-time congestion in MISO resulted from the lack of requisite transmission capacity needed to accommodate new wind energy resources. So furthermore, these constraints often create challenges, on particularly hot summer afternoons, cold winter evenings. And while our energy system is built to handle the extreme demands of the hottest summer days, coldest winter nights, it's often underutilized. And so I think a challenge isn't necessarily a lack of energy for data centers, but it's helping to manage these peak demand hours and helping to make sure that we are getting the most out of our existing grid. And this is really where grid enhancing technologies like dynamic line ratings play such a key role. As wind speed as wind speeds increase, you're able to increase the line ratings, see more power flow through. And this is often at times of the day when demand is the highest. So the late afternoon, early evening hours. So while we know there is uncertainty around load forecasting and exactly how many data centers will be built and when, what is certain is that the already limited capacity of the transmission grid to support the new load will be increasingly strained by the ever climbing 24/7 demand associated with data centers, as just about all internet operations today flow back to these facilities. So, as we look to move forward amidst these uncertainties, we do know that the timeline for technology solutions like dynamic line ratings is much faster than the 5 to 10 year window in which transmission projects are planned and executed. So, if I'm a utility looking to serve a new data center, for example, and that new load requires some new infrastructure, in the transmission space, again, with new lines being in the 5 to 10 year timeline horizon, that timeline doesn't necessarily match with what the customer is looking for. So how can I look to use, a new tool in the toolbox, dynamic line ratings, to get 20% more power 95% of the time over existing lines to help serve that load? The customer can use on-site generation or storage to help backfill when that capacity is not available, all while traditional investments can be sequenced over a longer period of time. So that's really a valuable tool for speed. We know that dynamic line readings can be deployed quickly in a matter of months. So offering a fast solution to help expand the capacity of the grid and allow these major loads like data centers to interconnect promptly. Being able to timely energize these new loads, it will help to spur economic growth, help to reshore manufacturing, and allow large tech companies, to help meet some of the ambitious net zero goals that they've set out to achieve in the coming years. So, looking forward to hearing from our next speaker, Brian with Google, and I'll turn it over to him.
Great. Thank you, Hillary, and thank you to the Lion Vision folks for putting this on and inviting us here today. John introduced me at the beginning, so we won't cover that. So next slide, please. I wanted to zoom out for a second and just sort of talk a little bit about how we've managed to get where we are as a company in terms of how we've thought about using our commercial ability to bring resources online and really grow. And so since 2007, as you see on the slide, we have really been focused on carbon neutrality and thinking about how we are compensating for our emissions across our company. And then, of course, since 2017, we have procured 100% renewable energy to match all of our demand. And what we realized as we were doing that was that no additional amount of annual matching through additional wind and solar procurement was going to decarbonize certain hours of the day where we were still getting our energy from fossil resources. And so that really inspired the pivot to our 24/7 carbon-free energy objective. And so what that says is that by 2030, we aim to power all of our operations around the world on 24/7 hourly carbon-free energy. And so that is where we are today. As part of that, we recognize we've got a long way to go from a commercial perspective to really bring on the types of resources that we need to meet our objectives going forward. And it's going to go obviously beyond wind and solar and storage. In fact, it's going to go into things like energy efficiency, right? We just announced earlier this week an investment in the Virginia Energy Efficiency Council's Energy Efficiency Workshop initiative to fund that in the state. Obviously, Virginia is a key state for us. We've also been thinking through what are the flexibility opportunities, right? We heard early on mention of the EPRI DC Flex initiative. That's something we are very interested in. And so I think there's a lot of different things, right, that we're going to be looking at to fill the gaps beyond what we have done traditionally. And we have to make sure that we have the commercial tools available to do that. So next slide, please. One of the tools that we are really excited about is something internally that we have called the Clean Transition Tariff. And so I think a lot of folks are probably familiar with the work that we have done in Nevada through our partnership with the utility NV Energy and enhanced geothermal developer Fervo Energy to use our capital, frankly, to bring on a 24/7 clean, firm technology to the grid in a way that benefits all ratepayers, all customers, and also meets our 24/7 carbon-free energy goal, while also insulating those customers from the cost of that asset. And so we're really excited about this as a tool to replicate throughout the country, but frankly, to replicate for all types of resources, right? This is something that could be adapted quite easily to investment in things like grid enhancing technologies. And so I think, I hear folks say all the time, all of the above energy strategy, right? I would like to maybe propose a change in that definition to capture all of the technologies, right? Transmission, gets, let's move out of the fuel source connotation of it and think about how can we adapt all of the technologies available to us today to achieve our decarbonization objectives and enable load growth. And let's have the commercial tools to really make that happen. So next slide, please. So I do want to talk for a moment just about sort of load growth and sort of the magnitude of it. We have all heard, I think every single panel for the past year has been about load growth and how we meet it. And so I really like that we've focused this panel on how do we address it. But I do really think it's important to note we do see this load growth as a really powerful opportunity, both to continue to grow the economy and lead on a global scale in national security and the development of AI. But it's also much broader than that, right? We're talking about reshoring of domestic manufacturing. We're bringing jobs and industry back here to the United States, right? This has been a policy objective for a very long time, and we're finally seeing it happen. And so Hillary noted, until now, we've really not faced a constraint on our growth by the energy system. That is no longer the case, right? We see lack of access to both energy, power generation, and the transmission system as a key risk to continued growth. And so I really just want to emphasize how important it is that we start to think about investing in things like dynamic line ratings and reconductoring, right? All of these things that can provide massive, massive benefit. And I think it's helpful to think about it in the context of, we all hear about the need to build new transmission infrastructure, and we're absolutely going to have to do that. But from our perspective, to maximize the benefit of new transmission infrastructure that we are building, we ought to first maximize the existing grid that we have today, right? We got to get the most out of what we have today before we know where it makes the most sense to invest in new infrastructure going forward. And given the challenges around building new infrastructure from a siting and permitting perspective, I think it helps the overall case if we can say, look, we have gotten everything out of the existing grid before we have started to build this new infrastructure. I think that's going to ease a lot of concerns. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity there. And then, of course, there's a lot of regulatory vehicles, right, that we can push for adoption of GETs in things like transmission planning. Order 1920 is a very good example of this, right? I think we should be looking at all of our RTOs and really pushing them to include GETs and factoring in these types of resources as part of their Order 1920 compliance filings and broader long-term transmission plans. So I would just end with, we're really excited about where we are. This is an opportunity. We are working hard with all of our partners to create the commercial structures and regulatory pathways that enable us to frankly do what we can do, right, to bring on the types of resources to meet the challenge we have in front of us in a way, frankly, that works well for all grid customers. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. Very much look forward to questions, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that, and congrats on all the great work that Google's done over the years to help accelerate new technology. But the next slide kind of goes to what we're seeing right now in the industry and what is happening. And obviously, nuclear has been in the news a ton, both with Microsoft's 3 Mile Island announcement, as well as Google's announcement with Kairos, and Amazon recently with X Energy. And all of that is really exciting. But the fact of the matter is, it's not particularly relevant to the problem that we're trying to solve this decade, which is how do we plug in as many GPUs as possible, as quickly as possible, as we build training models and build inferencing. That's really going to necessitate looking at how do we get more out of the existing grid, because even the most optimistic nuclear forecasts, we're talking about projects that are coming online early next decade, and likely it's going to be closer to mid next decade. And what we really need to be focusing on now very intently is how do we take some of these innovative tariff solutions like that Brian was discussing and start applying them to things like grid enhancing technologies and ways we can expand capacity. I think of these different types of green tariffs that we've done, that Google's done and others have done over the years, are excellent for finding ways to sleeve clean energy to customers or get clean energy onto the grid. We haven't seen the same sort of application of things like dynamic line rating and storage as transmission. And so if we take those same concepts and start to apply them, then we can address in the near term how we get more efficiency out of the existing system. On the next slide, as I think about the challenge that we have today versus what I worked on at my time at Microsoft, which was largely growing the cloud business. Right? I started at Microsoft in 2011, and did that for basically 12 years. So I was there when Azure was a tiny percentage of Microsoft's business. We probably had 150 megawatts of total data center capacity when I joined in 2011. By the time I left, we were adding well in excess of a gigawatt every year. So it was a huge transition. But one of the things that I think people fail to understand in terms of what happened over the last decade versus where we are today is we were able to grow the infrastructure, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, largely unconstrained, because we were in a period of time where load growth was flat across the industry. Utilities and IPPs had sort of overbuilt in the prior decade. So there was excess capacity on the grid. We were also deprecating a lot of on-prem workloads and moving those to the cloud, so that data centers really weren't putting a whole lot of pressure on the energy system. You didn't have to be an energy expert to build a cloud business or build an infrastructure business, like a co-location company, for instance. Now we're in a completely different world where we have load growth not just coming from AI, but we have load growth coming from onshoring of manufacturing, from electrification of transportation and buildings. So the environment is very different, where we're already in a period of load growth, and the denominator on which we're trying to grow is quite large, right? Growing 25, 30% a year on 150 megawatt denominator versus growing that same growth rate on a 4 to 5 gigawatt denominator is entirely different. So utilities are being faced with challenges that are uniquely different than what they were in the last decade. And so what we're going to have to do to continue growth to support AI is going to take a different set of innovation than what it took to grow our sort of first wave of data center growth. On the next slide, and what this really means is we have to work closely with utilities. I was just reading this morning some analyst report talking about, well, how are we going to power all these data centers? And often it comes to the answer of, well, data centers are just going to have to go off grid, or they're going to have to build all their own generation. I really think that's nonsense, because the scale of the problem we're talking about is a grid scale problem. Like, we're building grid sized assets that need a grid solution. There's a reason we have the grid. The diversity of the grid is so much more valuable than islanding on a power plant. And so we have to find ways to work closely with utilities, both on innovative tariff solutions, but also on the sort of the analytics of how do we find the right technologies in the right places that start to unlock incremental capacity. And then also, how do we think about the load side of the equation in terms of the potential for flexibility? Because data centers do have a lot of potential to be flexible. And so we need to find ways to work collaboratively with utilities to figure out how do we leverage grid enhancing technologies? How do we leverage battery as storage? How do we get those, those technologies to point to particular spots on the grid where we can deploy these gigawatt scale data centers? And then that allows utilities to do more long-term planning around, okay, what assets are we going to have to now bring into the equation? And if we can find ways to bridge the next, let's call it 4 to 6 years, we have a lot more flexible options once we get into the 2030s, from longer duration batteries, nuclear, geothermal, all things that can be done at much larger scale. But we have to, in essence, buy time. And the way we buy time is we get more out of the existing system. And this is where, dynamic line rating specifically is I look at it as very low hanging fruit in terms of things that we know how to do. We can do it quickly. We can immediately start unlocking capacity on the system, but it has to be done collaboratively with customers. So with that, I will turn it over to Hillary.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Next slide, please. One after that. So it was awesome to hear from both of the Brians, just with their thoughts and perspectives around this issue. It's one that Line Vision, we recently wrote a white paper about, that does highlight some ideas and recommendations for actions that both utilities, tech companies, key stakeholders can look to go forward with. And for utilities who are charged with being stewards of a safe and reliable grid, and in a number of states with also meeting clean energy standards, the use of all tools in the toolbox is really key to helping meet this moment. As we look to best prepare for large increases in load, whose exact trajectory will have certainty. Being able to use grid optimization tools like dynamic line ratings to get critical new data sets to help utilities understand what their system is capable of, help ensure that no capacity is being left on the table, and that existing infrastructure is optimized as they plan for both meeting load growth as well as clean energy standards. The DOE did a report earlier this year finding that a broad suite of tools needs to be leveraged to meet the anticipated demand growth, and the need for supportive policies to ensure all of those tools can be leveraged is really key. Because we know that as new hyperscale data centers are built, grid costs can really skyrocket. These facilities need both new power generation as well as accompanying grid infrastructure. So that's likely new or upgraded transmission and distribution lines, as well as substation upgrades. These are costs that are likely to be socialized or passed on to other customer classes. So using grid enhancing technologies like dynamic line ratings can help to ensure that existing infrastructure is being used to its maximum capabilities, and ultimately helps to demonstrate what's really just a consumer-friendly notion of using something you currently have to its maximum capabilities before you look to buy something new. Utilities can also look to adjust some of the forecasts, looking to incorporate more proactive planning measures. So this could be things like including, demand drivers, changing demand drivers, changing load modifiers specific to their service territory that are perhaps a bit more granular in nature. They account for both location and timing, because having increased granularity of inputs into load forecasts, as well as helping looking to leverage more scenario-based forecasting, can really help to inform a smarter planning process, and ultimately help to inform how to work when there are elements of uncertainty in that planning horizon. We've heard from Brian as well about utilities getting creative with creating specialized tariffs. Another good example is Duke. They have a proposed accelerating clean energy tariff, where they are working with large C&I customers on proposed clean energy tariffs to help support financing options for emerging technologies, which would allow companies to help achieve their own clean energy goals without increasing cost for other customers. Brian mentioned the clean transition tariff in Nevada, which is really exciting. And I think utilities can also look to use these kind of low-hanging fruit tools of grid enhancing technologies, dynamic line ratings, as a way to address customer affordability. Reducing congestion and optimizing existing assets to ensure that we're using them to their maximum capabilities kind of before and as we build new, that can produce real metrics and tangible savings. As affordability concerns, it absolutely needs to be addressed as we look to build the grid of the future, especially given that currently 1 in 4 low-income households in the U.S. currently spends more than 15% of their income on their energy bills. That's according to a recent analysis from the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. I think for the tech companies, heard some really great ideas today as key drivers of this load growth. They really have an important role to play in helping to advocate for the efficient build out of the transmission grid, how to identify and prioritize policies that help to, again, optimize existing assets, make them more efficient. I think, the announcement from EPRI last month about the DC Flex initiative is really exciting. That's going to look at how to explore how data centers can help support the electric grid, help to enable better asset utilization, and help to support the clean energy transition. So look forward to seeing some of the demonstrations that come out of that initiative as it gets started. If I could go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to just showcase a few examples of recent projects we've done here at Line Vision. One of the projects with National Grid in the UK was one that came together fairly quickly. National Grid was also, seeing increasing demand and was looking for innovative solutions that could help meet that demand, and also look to leverage domestic energy sources. So looking at offshore wind, due to a lack of transmission capacity, a 600 megawatt offshore wind farm was being curtailed. And again, that was preventing that, least cost clean power from reaching the grid, resulting in congestion costs. So Line Vision sensors were installed on a critical double circuit, connecting the offshore wind to the onshore grid. And the use of dynamic line ratings unlocked 19% additional capacity on that constrained line. And since the project's inception, about 1 gigawatt of additional capacity has been provided, allowing that clean offshore wind to flow to consumers in the UK. And to help contextualize, when you hear about increases of, 10%, 20%, from dynamic line ratings, there was a pilot that was done back in 2014 down in Texas. This was actually through the Recovery Act. And it found that just a capacity increase of 10% from dynamic line ratings was enough to eliminate virtually all congestion on the line with the dynamic line ratings technology. So here in the US, another recent project that we've done, we put forward a white paper, a case study with AES. We worked with AES and their utilities in Ohio and Indiana, where we deployed about 42 sensors on lines ranging from 69 kV all the way up to 345 kV. One of the lines studied had several large load interconnections, as well as an upcoming solar generation project on that line, and were projected to overload the line. And the results of the deployment saw a significant capacity increase in the range of 60% above the static line rating. On the lower voltage line, the field-based dynamic line rating sensor was able to identify a limiting segment. So this was in a kind of heavily vegetated section, and that limiting segment was reducing the carrying capacity of the entire line. So with that information, with that data, AES was able to determine that it will be able to reconductor only about a half a mile rather than the entire line, which that will now take about half the amount of time and cost about a quarter of what full reconductoring otherwise would have. So encourage folks to check out that case study. AES has been a real leader in the use of technology solutions like grid enhancing technologies. So next slide, please. To kind of wrap up, a map of the world. I think the issues that we talked about, aging infrastructure, the need for transmission capacity, these aren't, unique to the United States. This really is in many ways a global challenge. But we have seen U.S. utilities, looking to add these technologies as tools in their toolbox, as the challenges, again, facing the grid today really do require an all hands on deck approach. The grid is the backbone of our nation's economy. So by utilizing grid enhancing technologies, dynamic line ratings, it's really helping to give utilities the best data about, how much power can safely flow through that backbone, data that can help alert for potential anomalies that could pose a risk to grid reliability, and ultimately help to ensure that we're not leaving capacity on the table as we look to expand and build the grid of the future. So I think that's it, and look forward to some questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Hillary, and to our other presenters as well. We do have a couple questions in the chat, but feel free to type them in so we can take those as they come in. And let's get started with one here. How do we think about DLR variability serving data centers who often want 24/7 power? Can data centers adjust demand aligned with generation and transmission availability? Brian or Brian, one of you want to be able to address that one?
Yeah, happy to jump in on that. That's a great question. I mean, the fact of the matter is data centers are actually uniquely suited to provide flexibility back to the grid in forms of dispatchability. I mean, data centers have backup generators, data centers have batteries, data centers in some instances, but not probably as much as people would like, have the ability to flex their workloads as well. And so when you put that together, yes, the servers largely need 24/7 power. That is not the same thing as saying the data center needs 24/7 power at the utility meter. And we've been doing this for years. I mean, Microsoft did a natural gas backup in Cheyenne in 2016 to provide dispatchable service back to the utility. To get a data center connection in Ireland, you have to have a gas generator behind the meter and offer, dispatchable service. So this is not foreign to the industry. Unfortunately, I think it is not utilized as much as it should be. And this goes back to that conversation of why, working with utilities is so important. Because I was talking to a utility the other day, and they were saying, well, I've got, 20 data centers in line, for, connection right now. If anyone else comes in, it's going to be 7 years. And I said, well, what if they were willing to be dispatchable? And they said, well, I could connect them next week, but no one's ever asked me that. Right. Which is really, I mean, it's really the fault of the data center industry for not being more like leaning in more with utilities to say, hey, there are things we can do together. And if you're telling me you can only get me power 98% of the time, and I can do a dynamic line rating deployment that takes that to 99% or 99.5%, and now I only have to deal with the 0.5%, with some of my own assets, you can get to that 24/7 solution pretty easily.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I mean, we've been shifting workloads for a very long time, right? Through our carbon intelligent computing ability, right? We're able to shift workloads to different grids based on carbon intensity, right, of a given grid. And so I think, you're going to continue to see that, particularly for workloads that can be shifted, right? There are different types of workloads, and we're able to treat those differently. And so I think I do want to pick up on something Brian said, which is, right now, there's no real way to distinguish between certain types of new loads coming onto the grid, right? And so in places like Virginia, right, we're seeing 4 to 7 year pauses on new interconnection requests of anything 100 megawatts or greater. And so I think, as we're moving forward and thinking about, well, how do we start to differentiate between loads in a non-discriminatory manner, right, in a way that enables the utilities, frankly, to say, well, where can we put new loads onto the grid faster, right? Where can we connect people, to existing infrastructure, or in combination with, things like dynamic line ratings? It does create an opportunity for the industry to come to the table with the types of flexibility, right, that we can offer. The other thing I would just throw out there is I've heard, sort of a lot about the potential flexibility of AI workloads, right? And that as being somewhat different from things like traditional workloads. I would just say that I think as we move forward and as we all think about how we're incorporating AI into our products on a more regular basis, right? That's going to offset some of that sort of flexibility that we're going to have from just an AI training workload. And so there's obviously lots of opportunity, and we've been working closely with our partners through the DC Flex program, but frankly through just conversations and direct engagement with our utilities and with our RTO grid operators to think about how we can provide flexibility, when and where it's most valuable to the system.
Awesome, great perspectives. A question came in around if we could provide the link to the data center paper that was referenced. Yes, we will be sending out a follow-up email to all attendees, and it'll have the link to that paper in there, so everyone should be getting that at the end of the webinar. Had another question here. I'll kind of just shorten it down a little bit, but the point of the question is there any reason a utility would not want to interconnect a data center? When you go knock on their door and say, hey, we'd like to build a data center here, is there any reason they wouldn't want to do that?
I'll take that one first.
Go ahead. Yeah, there's lots of reasons.
No, I mean, well, I think, just to be very clear, right, utilities have an obligation to serve. And so, as we're moving forward, right, I do recognize we are facing a serious challenge that we've never faced before. And so I think, there's a lot of hesitation, right, to sort of connect these new large loads, right, in the way that we have done it. And so I think I don't think there's a reason to not interconnect a new large load, but there are reasons to offer quicker interconnection in exchange for more flexibility, or investments that bring our generation to the grid in a way that matches our new loads on the grid. Like I think there's a legitimate and really sound challenge, right, that we need to work with our utilities to address, but I don't think it's a reason to not interconnect. And I do want to, on that point real quickly, and Brian mentioned this in his remarks, I don't see anyone willing to raise their hand and say we are happy taking less reliability than what the grid provides, right? If you look at our services, and at least for my company, right, we have no interest in reducing our 5 nines reliability. We demand that, we need that. We all have an interest in the grid being able to serve that. And so I think these truly sort of islanded proposals out there, right, I don't know how much stock to put in them, frankly. And I think overall we do have a common interest in working towards building the grid that can serve that. And so it just all comes back to being partners, right? Yes, it's a huge challenge. We should be thinking about innovative ways to solve the problem, but it's not, not interconnecting, frankly, is not an option.
Yeah, completely agree. And I mean, the comment in that question too about utilities getting caught a little flat-footed. I mean, frankly, I think some of that also is on the data center industry for not really forecasting effectively and communicating effectively. I mean, I think everyone was sort of caught flat-footed on AI. I've heard Sundar say that. I've heard people at Microsoft say the same thing. Like, we were all surprised by Chat GPT-3, and Microsoft was actually building the infrastructure for it, and we were still surprised by it. Like the surprise was the way that it sort of captured the collective consciousness so quickly, was adopted so quickly, and has advanced so quickly. All of that was somewhat of a surprise. And so the utilities, yes, were not prepared for the growth. They were not prepared to be getting phone calls asking for a gigawatt of power. That was new for the industry. And so, and going back to the question of like, well, why wouldn't a utility want to say yes? I mean, again, they're getting not calls just from data centers, but they're also getting calls from folks that want to build factories in this country to produce solar panels and batteries. And the fact of the matter is, if you're an electric utility and you say yes to a data center and now you have to say no to a factory, that's going to be a problem for you, right? Because now you're going to have to go explain to your governor why you're not getting 2,000 jobs because you gave all your power to the tech industry. And so they do have to balance, how they're doing their planning and make sure they're, as Brian said, they have an obligation to serve. The question just becomes how quickly they're going to do that. And I think the data center industry's opportunity, again, is to go to utilities as partners and say, how can we help? How can we help you invest strategically in your system so that you get a win-win, right? You get a nice big baseload customer, which really actually helps their system substantially, but you still have incremental capacity to serve, the next comers that show up in the door that want to build that factory. So that you can build win-win solutions, but it just requires better collaboration between industry and utilities.
Can I just add something real quick to what Brian said, which I agree with everything he said. I do think there's back to the forecasting and transparency piece, right? Like I think it is absolutely on our industry to be very transparent with our utility partners and the RTOs about what our forecasts are over as long of a reasonably expected period as we can, right? Many of us have been doing that for a very long time. I think we probably need to go one step further, right? Where some of the load requests that are coming onto the system now are triggering the need for billions of dollars of infrastructure build out. And so I understand, right, why utilities may be hesitant. A lot of this load is new types of load that they've not dealt with at large scale in the past. And so I can understand why there may be a hesitation to trigger some of that infrastructure. And so I do think there is, and you're seeing this come to fruition, there is an opportunity for us to maybe raise our hand a little bit and say, hey, we understand this risk that is that we're being put on you. We're willing to accept some of that from a financial perspective, right? It's a way of putting our skin in the game to say we are going to show up, right? We are going to be there. You can count on that. You can build out infrastructure to meet this. And I think it's so critical that we provide some certainty into the load that is coming on to the grid, because right now we're looking at 52 gigawatts of new load in PJM in 5 years. As someone who's been in this industry for a very long time, it's hard for me to see how the puzzle pieces fit together into the status quo to make that happen. And so I think for our part, right, if the number is 52, the TOs and PJM have to have as much confidence in that number as we can give them. And so that is on us, and in consultation with our utility partners. And I think will be a big focus of work over the next couple of years to really dig into what those loads are and how accurate we can make it.
Yeah, thanks, guys. And speaking of putting skin in the game, here's a related question to that. Now, have we seen any three-way contracts between data centers, utilities, and then asset providers like Line Vision to enable the faster adoption of dynamic line rating technologies? I can just take a quick, two cents on that. So we've seen a lot of two-way contracts in Line Vision, between us and the utility that are directly in support of data center projects. But I've not seen any three-way contracts between those three types of entities. And I'm curious if there's any perspectives that y'all might have on what is preventing that, or is there some regulatory change that's needed to be able to make that a reality to facilitate like a sponsored upgrade, for example?
I don't think it's a regulatory change. No, I think it's just a commercial. I mean, you would have to potentially create a tariff, similar to the one that Google's done on, with Fervo. If what you're doing is targeting a specific deployment of a specific technology that needs specific cost recovery on behalf of a specific customer, but you can do that through an excess facilities charge, right? I mean, there's mechanisms we have to do it. It's really about finding, and it's funny, I was actually talking to Tim from Line Vision, COO, about this the other day, because he was saying something like, well, we keep getting pushback from utilities of it's not fixed firm, and I was like, well, You just need a non-fixed firm customer on the other side of that to say, I'm willing to take that. Again, going back to data centers' ability to, have some flexibility, because what data centers want is speed. So if you can show them that by doing this, by doing X, I can connect you 2 years earlier, like they're willing to do a lot of things in exchange for that, right? And so it's really about finding those solutions. And I had the same conversation with a battery storage company about this, about a project that they've been trying to get done. And they say, well, we just can't get it through the utility. And I know for a fact that there are data centers sitting on that node that are not getting connected right now. And I was like, you just have to connect the dots between these two things. And it does take some orchestration, but it's not rocket science, right? It's about just doing the analytics on how would X technology enable Y in terms of excess capacity sooner on the grid, and who's willing to pay for that. Like who, and the willingness to pay to go fast is very, very high. And I can say that because I don't work for a tech company. Brian doesn't have to agree with me. But the willingness to pay is very high today, because the value proposition for plugging in a GPU, building a larger training model is so enormous that because the lock-in effect that creates for the next decade or 2 decades is huge. And so this is where I get really optimistic about the ability to deploy some of these things in this environment, because if utilities can see how these technologies unlock capacity sooner, and you have a customer that is very much willing to pay for this, then you can start to capture some of those excess rents that are missing in the market right now.
To follow on to your answer, Brian Janis, just curious, like who does that, or who should be responsible for that orchestration you mentioned? Because that seems like it's maybe like the key to everything, is just putting all the pieces together and getting the right players aligned. Like who's responsible for that?
Well, that's a softball for Cloverleaf, because that's basically what we do. We saw this opportunity to say there's things that we can do outside of the pressure to deliver, which is what the hyperscalers have. And I did that for 12 years, and I understand like my ability sometimes to be creative was hampered by the fact that I had 1,000 things on my plate at any one time that I was trying to juggle. And so stepping out of that, we can take time and work closely with utilities. And if it takes several months, if it takes a year, that's fine, because we don't have that same sort of pressure. Our focus is we know the demand for electricity coming from AI is higher than the available supply. So anything we can do to work with utilities to create, creative solutions that can unlock that through that orchestration, that's going to be valuable to the industry. And whether that goes to Google or whether it goes to Microsoft or Amazon or NVIDIA, it doesn't really matter. I mean, we're looking at it as, sort of a secular play on AI demand. So we are one of the companies that is working to do that. And we're working with a lot of utilities around the country and having these conversations right now.
Great. Here's a different flavor of a question. Do data centers have the ability to prioritize different types of data? For example, Google Photos versus an electronic medical record. And could you shift the load to be able to effectively use one that is not as critical in a slower, less compute intensive way that doesn't require as much admissions? Is that something that's possible?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we can distinguish between certain types of workloads, and it's interesting. We often refer to workloads internally sometimes as like base load and peak workloads, right? Kind of similar to the power system. And so you do have some ability to move around those peak workloads. It's generally a fairly small portion of it. So it once you start digging in beyond that, it gets pretty difficult to start distinguishing out what types of work streams or workloads you're able to really kind of distinguish and then think about moving. But yeah, for the most part, we do have some flexibility, at least at a higher level, to shift workloads around, based on priority and other metrics.
Great, thanks for those comments, Brian. Here's one from earlier, I missed earlier. So how are we going to get the extra power for data centers in the near and in the long term? What are you thinking there? And then a follow on to that is, does that present an opportunity for carbon reduction?
You said, like, where's the power going to come from?
I think, yeah, that's the root of it, right? Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think in the near term, it's going to come from efficiency, right? The near term is going to come from, we actually have, most of the time, we have way more power than we need, right? We're talking about, the real issue is how do we manage the peak constraints? And so if we can utilize more flexibility, we can get more and utilize grid enhancing technologies, we can get more out of the existing system. That's really what's going to be the alternative to accelerating building just a bunch of new natural gas, right? So the more, if we can get the most out of the existing system, doesn't mean we're going to build no gas, but it means we can substantially reduce the amount of gas that we have to build between now and 2030 and allow time for newer technologies like advanced geothermal, like nuclear, to start to fill in the gap in the next decade. But if we don't do that efficiency piece, we don't focus on getting more out of the existing grid, the alternative is going to be the one thing that we do know how to do relatively well, which is build gas plants.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think we need to be doing everything possible in the near term to really mitigate the amount of new, particularly fossil infrastructure that we're building, right? These are long-lived assets that once we put them on the grid, they will be around for a very long time. And yes, utilization rate matters, but if we're adding new combined cycle capacity, we're probably adding additional pipeline capacity, and those are things we all obviously want to avoid. And so I think there's a strong incentive to really think about how we do get the most out of the existing system, how we do become most flexible, right, and how we do just kind of take advantage of everything we do have today.
I would just piggyback that I think, again, along this theme of efficiency, I would, that also includes addressing curtailments of existing resources. Solar and wind that we know is getting curtailed. How can we use GETS in a tactful manner to ensure that those curtailments are reduced?
And Hillary, there's one question here, which I'll probably maybe ask you to comment on, and I think you touched on some of the points in your latter slides. Even with grid enabling technologies, forecasts for AI energy needs are predicted to outpace nearly all transmission projects for years to come. How do you think data centers can bridge the gap in the near term?
I think we've kind of heard that's kind of the theme of the conversation today. Flexibility, kind of all hands on deck approach to how we kind of deal with near term, kind of focus on efficiency as some of these newer generation sources and solutions that Brian had mentioned kind of come into play later this decade, the start of the next.
Perfect.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think we got time maybe just for one more, we can sneak it in. There seems like a modeling need to quantify how much load growth can be met with things like efficiency and GETS to avoid utilities and RTOs feelings of an RA crisis resulting fast tracks for firm resources. Do you all agree, and is anyone doing this?
I completely agree, and there are a number of different entities that are working on this. I mean, one is actually Google's Tapestry inside their Google X organization. So that's a group that we've engaged with. There's other early stage companies. One called Peak Energy, Pearl Street, that are doing a lot of this grid analysis. And then you have individual companies, obviously like Line Vision, that have their own capabilities to do that with respect to DLR. I know Form Energy can do that with Formware to look at how you could use long duration batteries. So there's lots of different pieces out there. It's really about bringing it all together, right? Bringing it all together into an actual this is the technical solution, then here's the commercial wrapper that would make that feasible. There's still a lot of work to do. So I'm not saying it's the work is not done in this space. There's a lot of innovation that's still needed, but there's definitely a focus on that from a number of different entities.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think that's where it comes down to getting the load forecasting, and sort of that has to be as accurate as possible, right? We're never going to get it 100% right. We got to be doing everything we can to make it as right as possible, so that we're not inadvertently over-indexing on a problem that may or may not be as extreme, right, as it would be that could lead to investments in long-term stranded assets. So we've really got to focus on getting that as accurate as possible.
Awesome. Well, we have used every available minute of our time today, and great conversation. Thank you so much to our presenters, Hillary, Brian, and Brian. We really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you all for watching, and we will be sending out both recording and then some summary emails to follow. Cool. Thank you all.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.